Good afternoon, good morning, depending upon where you're joining us from. I'd like to thank you for joining us for the webinar today. Sorry for a little bit of a late start. Had some tough technical difficulties there, but what we wanted to focus on today was single sign-on, implementing native single sign-on for the PeopleSoft systems. So as we go through today, just a little bit of meeting management. We are using GoToWebinar, so there's a control panel. Everybody is muted, so you cannot speak during the call. If you have any questions, please use the GoToWebinar control panel. You'll see a little questions tab. You can actually submit questions that way, and I will make sure that they get answered during the session today. You can always email us at info@appsian.com as well for any follow-up questions, and we will make sure those get answered as well. So let's go ahead and get started today. So when we're talking about Appsian, one of the things that I thought I'd do real quick is start with who we are, who I am, and what we wanted to talk about. So Appsian has two main product spaces. We've actually got a UX product and a security product. Obviously, today we're going to be talking a little bit more in depth about the security product, specifically about single sign-on. I'm not going to go into the entire product. This is a little bit more of a focused webinar specifically on single sign-on. So I want to make sure that I cover off in that in detail. So I'm not going to be going into a lot of the other features. I will do a couple of slides at the beginning to kind of build the message, who we are, what we're talking about, and so on and so forth. My name is Greg Wendt. I'm the Executive Director of the Security Solutions here at Appsian. Been here 5 years now, so kind of one of the the aged guys on the team, if you want to look at it like that. I hate to say that, but about 22, 23 years in PeopleSoft from that perspective. So I've played enterprise architect role in both higher ed, commercial, retail, oil and gas. So lots of different roles. Started out as a developer and then finished up with my employers as an enterprise architect. So I've managed the security side and self-service rollouts quite heavily through most of my career. So it's something when you're talking about implementing single sign-on, there's a lot of pros and cons as to why you want to do that, how you want to do it, and the advantages of why you want to do it. So jumping into the topic today, though, let's go ahead and start with, security challenges have really changed, and it's hard for some of these traditional ERPs to bend and move and have to comply to what's going on. If you think about a lot of your employees or students or, your users of your system, how do they access the system? What is an efficient way for them to be able to do it? Sometimes you may be talking about retirees, for example. Self-service users don't always get into the system very frequently. It's often not when they do. Sometimes there's always a high ping in password resets, for example. So, business is now dynamic and mobile. So all of those people are accessing, especially in, say, higher ed. Higher ed is extremely mobile. A lot of mobile use there versus some of the other industries as a whole that we're going to look at. And compliance requirements are changing and ever expanding, especially when you talk about data privacy, and the user-centric threats are rising. When you think about that, what I'm really wanting you to take away is the fact that individual users are being targeted. The way things were in the past, sometimes there would be broad swaths of, say, a phishing attack where maybe thousands of users would be targeted at one particular time. It's not necessarily the case anymore. It's very targeted to a handful, 2, 3, 1. So they know exactly. They'll shadow these users, they understand what's going on, and then they target them with a very, very well laid out attack that looks very official, and a lot of people will fall for those. So when we talk about, us as a company, quickly looking at the different verticals that we're in. And from a security perspective, it's a little bit different than our UX product. But all of these different verticals, government to higher ed, for example, are all looking to secure their environments in multiple different ways. We have a great layered security platform. Our application security platform can protect against multiple different aspects of how people can access, utilize, and work within your system. And what we find is there's different needs and requirements in each of these verticals. Some are very common, but going back to kind of the comment of what I was saying earlier about higher ed, they've always been publicly accessible. When you compare that to some of the other business units or groups, they aren't. They haven't been. So from that particular perspective, higher ed kind of cut their teeth on this 10, 15 years ago. They've always been. So it's something they've been dealing with for many, many years versus some of these other commercial or government organizations, financial, are just starting this. So they're kind of behind the curve on thinking about the security of their projects. And it's also just very different with the thought process as to how you're going to allow those users to access what you want them to be able to see, or the transactions you want them to be able to work with through that process. So, going back to some of what I was talking about earlier with business is now dynamic and mobile. If you think about it, mobile applications, remote work, self-service, BYOD, all of these things cause many different challenges for an IT group, especially managing and working with an ERP system like PeopleSoft. And so it's something that, trying to integrate, trying to make it very smooth, the transition between application sets is very important. And single sign-on is a key factor to that. It's a proven fact that if you can implement a very good single sign-on system, you're going to end up with your users transitioning in and out of the applications, working closer together, better collaboration. And those are some of the many reasons why people want to implement single sign-on. There's big ROI for these type of implementations. Data privacies, obviously the data privacy regulations have been changing and growing. I'm not going to go into a lot of that today. I just kind of want to bring it up because, especially with the realm of single sign-on, it is something that can help or hinder. A lot of times people are going to implement multi-factor authentication to help with data privacy and regulations and tracking of who's seeing what type of data. So it's a holistic issue that a lot of organizations are dealing with at this particular moment. We have a lot of solutions for that. Once again, I'm not going to cover off on them too much today because we are focusing on single sign-on today. The insider threat, one of the things that I find, and I kind of brought this up for a reason with single sign-on, is there's a lot of implementations of single sign-on specifically where organizations still allow high privileged accounts to utilize a two-tier connection into PeopleSoft. So they're actually still validating with PeopleSoft user ID, password, credentials, and frequently that's going to be a PeopleSoft admin, DBA, maybe a report or a batch user style account. And it's very important to be able to stop that kind of situation from happening. You want, when you're implementing single sign-on, you want everybody to be flowing through the same authentication method, regardless of all of those different accounts. And it's important to be able to do that and track and understand who's doing what. The commonality as to why people normally do that still within a single sign-on implementation is the fact that it's a shared account. That shared account allows multiple different people. Maybe you have 3 or 4 PeopleSoft admins or 3 or 4 security admins, and they're going in and updating information. And, they really don't track all of that under their own account because they have their own account for their self-service and then that high privilege style account to be able to go in and do those style roles. So it's important to be able to track and understand the difference between those two and really try to get everybody into your single sign-on authentication method so it can be consistent, and it will help cut down on insider threats. One, because it gives you the visibility as to who's doing what inside of the application sets as well. So the lack of response, just some information, it really deals into the logging that we provide. We can shorten that response cycle really into minutes rather than months to years when you're dealing with having to solve problems inside of your PeopleSoft system. So stepping into why single sign-on is also implemented is the perimeter defenses in and of themselves are not necessarily a full understanding of a lot of these ERP systems. If you think about PeopleSoft as a whole, there are no web pages that people are actually accessing. It's all built. It's dynamically done out of people tools. It's metadata driven. So it becomes very difficult for traditional load balancers to understand these applications. It's not like these are files sitting on a server somewhere that are just XML files or HTML files that you can go peruse and search and understand everything that this particular page is doing. They're not built like that. They don't work like that. So it causes challenges with some of your traditional perimeter defenses, which is one of the reasons why, from a single sign-on perspective versus, an ERP two-tier connection into PeopleSoft, using those different authentication models becomes important, because when you're dealing with an identity provider, that's designed and built for very robust password controls. PeopleSoft's got okay password controls. Really, it's all right. But, when you're talking about special characters, long passwords, aging out of those passwords, how often do you need to change them? Obviously, you're going to have more controls out of software that was designed and built to manage user IDs and passwords rather than an ERP application that was really designed and built to process payroll or manage students, for example. So multiple different reasons as to why these challenges come into effect. So when we talk about our application security platform, we do allow you to control your core ERP data across PeopleSoft, SAP, and Oracle EBS. And it allows you to contextually, granularly, or dynamically control that through multiple different aspects. As I said earlier, it really is a holistic approach to the security and the business model risks. And single sign-on just happens to be a portion of what we're actually controlling when we're talking about our entire platform. So when you do get into the entire platform, one of the areas that I want to talk, we're basically talking about a modern access management up here in the corner, specifically with single sign-on. It allows us to control how the users are going to interact, how they're going to authenticate with the system, to enforce that consistently throughout your users, for everybody who's accessing the system, for example. And then you can layer in some other security controls as you see fit. We have a lot of customers that really do start with single sign-on because it's a very quick implementation. When I was actually talking to somebody yesterday about an implementation, and one of the things that I found that was really interesting as we've been doing this for a while is the fact of organizations changing their identity management system. So all of ours is a configuration, and it communicates directly to that identity provider. So when you think about that from an implementation advantages, disadvantages type scenario, one main advantage is maybe you're working with Shibboleth today, or some sort of identity provider today. I just happen to pick Shibboleth. So you could be working with that and you want to shift to Azure or ADFS. You can actually set both of them up and transition very easily between the two. So it allows you to implement and quickly move between identity providers, because you can have multiple identity providers configured within the same PeopleSoft system. And we have multiple customers, that have done that. And this is something that I found that was very unique. It wasn't something that I expected when we were talking about implementing single sign-on. I didn't think organizations would change their identity providers or as frequently or as often as they do. But it does happens quite frequently. So it is a side effect of something that, I find very, very interesting from just a data perspective as to the utilization of our single sign-on product helps transition between these different implementations as you mature as an organization and maybe decide to switch which ones you want to work with. So as a whole, the main factors of our application security platform, we do allow you to connect into, SSO. Obviously, I'm going to be talking a lot more. We're going to be demoing that in just a minute. But we also have multi-factor authentication, field level access, our field level masking of data, to where you can decide exactly what fields you want masked, where you want them masked, how you want them masked. So all of your users, you can depend conditionally. And this is where that dynamic contextual control comes into play, as to how do I want my users to interact with the data? What do I want them to see? Where do I want them to see it? How do I want them to see it? And it's all configuration, not customization of any of the pages or fields behind the scenes. And then we've got very detailed logging and analytics that allows you to get a real-time view into what your PeopleSoft system is doing. So what users are using what pages, for example, any sort of scenario like that. So the entire platform does give you a very cohesive protection inside of your PeopleSoft system. And today, obviously, we're just going to be focusing on single sign-on. So what I wanted to do is go into just a little bit more detail of how the single sign-on application works. So I'm going to go ahead and build this slide out just a little bit. So what happens is we're going to turn around and look at your users when they're making a request of the PeopleSoft system. What we're doing with that request is we're going to see if it's an authenticated request. By authentication, to think PS token, that they've already authenticated into the PeopleSoft system. In the scenario that they have not, what we're going to do is we're going to challenge, or we're going to go validate that request against the identity provider. That identity provider is then going to let us know whether or not that user has an active session that already exists inside of the identity provider. So maybe they already have an Azure session going. They're using Office 365 and they've already gone into email or whatever they're working with. Okay, well that session exists at that point. So what it's going to do is it's going to take an attribute coming back from that identity provider and it's going to map that user to us and to the PeopleSoft system. We're going to accept that. We're going to go ahead and map that user, and what they're going to end up with is an authenticated session into the PeopleSoft system as if they had logged in directly to PeopleSoft themselves, but we just happen to be, using the identity provider for the authentication request. The nice part about it is our platform communicates directly to the identity provider. So there isn't a proxy server. There's no additional, hardware or software that you have to put into play. We communicate directly through SAML to ADFS, Azure. Microsoft is, a little bit different than a true SAML token. So any of those mechanisms, we can communicate to the identity provider. In the scenario of the situation where maybe a user hasn't authenticated to the identity provider yet, but they want to go in and access a PeopleSoft resource. At that particular point, what we're going to do is we will hand them over to the identity provider, and the identity provider will go through the entire authentication request. So at that point, they're going to put in their user ID and password, and they're going to authenticate. That's going to come back to us with the attribute value, and then we're going to be able to bring them in and allow them to access PeopleSoft just as they normally would in that scenario. So I've done enough talking from that perspective. So I think let's go in and see some of this in action. So what I want to do is I'm going to start by signing into Office 365. So I'm going to go ahead and pick a Vicky Zinn account. Vicky Zinn is just a standard self-service user inside of the demo system. So I'm going to go ahead and authenticate as Vicky Zinn. What I've done is I've created a SharePoint site. That SharePoint site allows me to drill into PeopleSoft content. Very simply, I can log in, I can see it, I don't have to log in again, which is one of the big things that you're going to see here. So I'm going to go ahead and access that content. Just going to open a new tab. If you're looking at the URLs, I don't know if you could see them because they flashed through there pretty quickly. What they did was it was going through that validation. It was going through and communicating with the identity provider that first time to let us know, A, they already have a session, B, let's map the user and get them into the PeopleSoft system to where they can have access and see the system like they normally would. I'll go ahead and make that page just a little bit bigger. And you can see just from a usability perspective, we have actually masked out the Social Security number with our data masking technology. So you can pick and choose how you want that field to look. I have a partial mask value. It also can be one of those scenarios where if somebody's coming in external to your organization, then I want to mask the data. If they're on your network, then I don't need to mask the data or allow them to see it. Your choice. You can pick and choose how you want to implement that based upon those other layers, those contexts that you want to add into that security platform. Another frequent request that we end up with is somebody's going to send me a fully embedded email. and inside of there, I may have a full embedded link into PeopleSoft. Maybe it's from a work list, workflows, approvals, any sort of scenario like that you want somebody to be able to jump into the PeopleSoft system quickly, update information, say yes, no, deny, approve, whatever the business reason might be. But it allows them to jump into the PeopleSoft system very quickly. So I'm actually jumping into the account. You can see that I now have access to the page. I didn't go in and log in. You can see that I have multiple accounts set up for this particular user in this system. The reason it is because I want them to be able to access this page, but not necessarily update some of their information unless they do go through a multi-factor authentication. So we've got field level multi-factor authentication tied in, so we can bring in and make them go through that stepped up authentication without them having to do it just to be able to access this page. So very streamlined, very efficient, allows the users to be able to maneuver in and out. And this is one of the main key aspects of the collaboration and the effects of what a lot of people talk about with single sign-on and the advantages behind it, because you are going through, you're able to transition between the applications very seamlessly. So if you have cloud-based applications, on-prem based applications, the users can flow between the two of them very easily without having to do anything special for access, which really does improve how they do their job, how efficient they can be at their job. So I'm going to go ahead and sign out of there, go ahead and close out of this session. One of the things that I wanted to do, though, is I wanted to come in a different way, because it becomes very important to be able to control how your users are going to access the system. As I was kind of talking about earlier with the example of what happens if they haven't authenticated, what we're going to do is control and allow them access to the system, but we want them to go in the same method, the same way from an authentication request as we would from anything else. So I'm going to go ahead and select a deep embedded link into PeopleSoft, just a user trying to access a page. I'm going to go ahead and authenticate. As you noticed, that was actually my user ID and password for ADFS. It was not my PeopleSoft user ID and password. I was authenticating to the Microsoft IDP at that point. So it allows me in, and I can control that so the users are always going through the same process to authenticate into the system. So that way you don't have to worry about them coming in a different way. Very important from that perspective. One of the things that, you can see as well, I haven't pointed this out yet, but if you go to the navigator, I have my full list of permissions, roles, access that I normally could do if I authenticated to the system directly myself. One of the things that we will still do as well, I'm going to go ahead and sign out of this session, is we give you the ability to actually connect to this system directly as well. When we're talking about that, there are some organizations that that can do this. So if we log in, what we're going to do in this scenario is I'm actually going to change this URL. I'm using a newer system today. Well, maybe I won't. So what happens is we can utilize the same user ID and password as the PeopleSoft credentials if need be. So this kind of goes back to that example of what I was talking about earlier with those high privileged accounts. So I can log in and say PS1, and I'm in with my normal 2-tier credentials. So I've been able to access this system 3 different ways. I can go through with an authentication that already exists on my identity provider, whatever that identity provider might be. I can also authenticate if that session doesn't exist on the identity provider, so it will challenge that user for their login event. Once they go through their login credentials, then it'll allow them to the access into PeopleSoft. And then we've also got the same option of being able to control and allow them in a normal PeopleSoft authentication model in case you have to have accounts that are accessing that way. One of the things that I want to show you, though, is an option around that. So I've got one of my other systems configured. So I'm going to pull this over real quick, and I am going to access another PeopleSoft system. And what I want to show is really a privileged access. And by privileged access, what it's doing is it allows you to transition into a higher level account. So what I'm going to do is just access a system. I'm going to go to the classic home. And one of the main things I was talking about earlier in the presentation was the idea of those high privileged accounts, how to manage those. Sometimes they're not in the identity provider, for example. So it's often a backdoor to bypass multi-factor authentication, for example. So, and you're talking about very high privileged style accounts. So what we've done is we've created a privileged access that allows you to transition or switch user into a higher level account. You have to be configured as to which accounts you can be transitioned or switched into. But if I go in and switch into, say, a PeopleSoft, the PS account, which is the highest privileged account, you're going to notice that I immediately get challenged for a multi-factor event. So I'm going to go ahead and push that through. I'm going to go ahead and approve it real quick, and you'll see that I drop into the application. The nice part about what we're doing now as well is it's not just about the switch user event. It's now that we have implemented tracking, very detailed tracking about what this user is going to do. That only happens when somebody has gone into this stepped up level account. So very streamlined, very efficient. It still allows, in this scenario, it allows the user to utilize a single sign-on. So they can authenticate via the identity provider. They could then switch into that higher privileged account. You could get the detailed tracking of what that admin is doing inside of the application. And then when they need to switch back to the other account or to act as themselves, they can just as quickly move back, press the button, and now I'm acting as that other user. I'm back to my normal low privileged account. So I'm not in that stepped up account anymore. So it allows you some better account management and still able to control access via the single sign-on options coming in. So I'm going to flip back over here. I'm going to sign out of one of these real quick. And I want to sign back into the system. So let's go here, and I'm going to authenticate, and it's going to drop me in. So let's look at the configuration, because we've talked about how this interacts and how we can enforce the separate users to have that consistent authentication model. So I'm going to go into, and when we talk about our architecture, you'll see that I have a new menu item here called Appsian. This is delivered when we install our application security platform. So I'm going to go ahead and drill into the menus that are there. When I go into the configure firewall behavior, you're going to notice that I have a rule set up, and it's this ADFS challenge. So I'm going to go ahead and open this up. And through this process, let's see, I'm going to look at a quick question here real quick. So the question is really about the higher privileged access of being able to switch into the account, and can they do that with high privileged accounts, or could it be a different account that has the same or lower privileges? The answer is yes. You can really set that up to allow them to switch into any particular account. That's your option to set up the way you want to. It's all set up via configuration pages that you can walk through. So it's very streamlined, easy configuration. That's what you'll figure out with our system. Is it's all configuration, which I'm fixing to show you, and it's not customization. We did have another question come in as I asked that one of, do we support the ping IDP? Yes, we do. We actually have several customers that are running ping. So pretty much, from an implementation perspective as to who we support, I have not found an identity provider that we haven't been able to work with, because most of them will communicate with the SAML 2 very easily. So it's just a configuration which I'm fixing to jump into and allow you guys to see that. So what I've got open here is the rule. So everything that's actually happening are security events that are happening to this system are all applied against the system with our rules. So I opened up the rule for single sign-on. So what happens, or what we're looking for here is we have a couple of defined conditions. Our conditions have to be true before our actions down below are going to fire, is basically the way this is designed. So we have a couple of things that we're looking for. One, that the user's not logged in, because we don't want, we want the user coming in from an unauthenticated session to verify that we need to push them into an authentication request. So that's one of the first things that we're looking for. And then the other is that they're not coming from the login request page, which is one of the options that I had configured. And keep in mind, this is an option. You can choose to do this however you want to. But what we do is, in the demo, we allow to still connect to the delivered PeopleSoft login page. So what this is doing is saying that I'm not at the login page. It's something that I'm requesting a deep embedded link. So if I go in and look at the configuration, these are one of our actions. Very simple action. You can select the definition or the action type from the drop-down list. The fields up at the top are really just a configuration or an example of what it's going to be called. But down below, you select a profile or configuration. So basically all that is this is going to be the real configuration of what's actually happening. So if I go and look through, just so you guys know where I went, since I clicked on the button, where I actually went was our cloud identity, SAML ADFS identity providers configuration. So that's what just opened up behind the scenes, just so you understand where I went. And then from this perspective, I've got just a definition. What am I going to call this? What is it going to be labeled inside of PeopleSoft? As I select the dropdown, I can select which communication protocol we're going to be working with. Is it ADFS? Is it SAML 1.1, SAML 2.0? I wouldn't suggest anybody really utilize SAML 1.1 at this particular point. Everybody should be using SAML 2. But then at that particular point, it's about the configuration of where where the identity provider is. What are we going to use to authenticate? So what URLs? Where do I go? So that's what all this is set up for. Basically, this configuration tells us as a platform how to communicate with the identity provider. Very streamlined, very efficient. We can also set private keys down below to where we actually are checking a signature of the keys moving back and forth between the system. I would definitely recommend that would be set up inside of a production environment. A couple other features that we do here is user mapping and configuration. So when I look at the configuration, there's about 5 or 6 lines of XML that need to be loaded into the identity provider. And inside of the identity provider, what it does is it registers this PeopleSoft system inside of that IDP so that we can actually communicate with the identity provider. So that's really the mapping of to who I'm communicating with and allowing that to talk back and forth. So that's the XML that gets loaded into the identity provider. The other things that you're really looking at is user mapping. What attribute am I going to take back and accept into the system? What am I passing back so it knows who I am inside of PeopleSoft? Frequently, it's the name ID. Doesn't have to be set up as the name ID attribute. You can use some other fields if you want. It's just from, pretty common with a SAML 2 implementation that you're going to see the name ID field. So, but the nice part about it is all configuration, not customization. And this goes back to some of those transitions of what I was talking about earlier, of switching between identity providers. If you decide, somebody asked about working with Ping, maybe you're moving from Ping to Azure. That's great. Configure them both, makes it very easy for the users to transition between the two. We've got some organizations that obviously have multiple identity providers configured. One of the most configurations that I've seen inside of a single PeopleSoft instance, as I think 5 different identity providers inside of one single instance. So depending upon multiple different conditions, we're going to challenge one of those identity providers. So it is all configuration, and it does support many things like that. So as you can see, configuration of single sign-on it doesn't have to be so difficult. You don't have to set up proxy servers. You don't have to do all of these things. It's a very streamlined and efficient configuration to be able to come in and set it all up. You're not having to code a bunch of different things to be able to make this work. We handle all of that for you. And we've got customers doing single sign-on on all of the major, recently released tools releases. I can't remember the furthest version back that I could commit to that somebody's running, but I know we've got 5.5, 5.6, 5.7 customers running single sign-on easily, and I'd probably think some 5.4s. So we handle all the differences between those different releases to make it easy on you guys, which once again, from an implementation perspective and support, makes it far easier to keep it up and running. When we do talk about implementations, normally our projects are around 35 to 40 days, or 30 to 45 days. Sorry, I think I said that wrong. And really that's just because of normally the testing cycles. We get installed. We'll do a session with your organization. We'll install the product. Then we'll have a secondary call that actually configures the product, goes through the different rules to set up the configuration of that. And then basically at that particular point, we follow your testing cycle. So a lot of times there's requirements that you have to sit inside development or stage for, a week or 10 days or whatever it is from your change control practices. So that's normally one of the reasons why that it takes 30 to 45 days to be able to go through this. So from that particular perspective, it is very efficient, streamlined. It really helps, bring your PeopleSoft system in line with the rest of your enterprise initiative goals. So you can plug it in, you can have it work with your SAML provider, use that support and authentication to allow greater ease of access for all of your users moving forward. So I'm going to flip back over. So, and really from a topic perspective, that's what I wanted to cover off on today. I went a little bit longer than I kind of figured I would have. We normally schedule these for about a half hour with just doing a specific demo on the particular product space. So from that particular perspective, if there are any additional questions, you can definitely use the GoToWebinar control panel and ship those over to me now, or you can follow up with info@appsian.com and shoot an email there. We can definitely set up another session, for you and your organization. We can go in and show you whatever you need and go into whatever details. So with that, I do appreciate your time. I know your time is very valuable, so I want to make sure that we give you back as much as possible. So I appreciate your time and attendance today. Thank you very much for joining us with Appsian, talking about single sign-on. We look forward to seeing you on another webinar soon. Thank you.